All good? Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna Leddy. I'm a director of analysis at Darktrace. And today I'm going to be talking about using AI to respond to attacks. I think this is actually a fantastic follow-up to the last session that we heard, as we talked about the concept of AI being used by attackers and how humans are often the weak spot. We can't keep up with the attacks that we're seeing today. And when the attackers are using AI, our thought is our only option is to use AI in the defense. So first, I'd like to give a really quick overview of Darktrace. We were founded in 2013 by mathematicians out of the University of Cambridge. And since then, we've really grown exponentially. We now have over 7,000 customers around the globe, offices and a presence in over 110 countries. And last year, we went public on the London Stock Exchange, which really enabled us to double our spend in research and development and put more work into the bespoke machine learning and AI that we have always developed. So before I actually start to talk about some of that technology, I'd like to give just a brief perspective of what is the threat landscape today. What have we seen in the last year? So first of all, geopolitical cyber conflict. I'm not referring to any particular nation states or wars, but the fact is we have seen state-backed actors from multiple countries disrupting technology, running disinformation schemes, stealing personal information. And in fact, we have seen increased government response in result of that. We've seen that the US Department of Justice has declared ransomware at the same threat level as terrorism. And we have seen some successful takedowns of various ransomware and other cyber criminal groups around the globe. I do say successful in air quotes because I think we'll see in the long run how successful these really are when they have affiliates that are far-reaching and in places where we may not actually be able to take them down. These attacks are still successful despite this increased government attention on them. And that's for a few reasons. First of all, we've really seen a rise in software supply chain attacks. As we rely on more third-party software, more third-party suppliers, we've seen a number of these big-name attacks, Log4j, SolarWinds, and we've seen the impact they can have on hundreds, if not thousands of customers around the globe. And while we can do what we can to try and harden our software, try and test things, it's hard to predict where the next one of these attacks is going to come from. How do you predict a 0 day and what will come next? Then, of course, there's the ever-present threat of insiders. And insider threat has always been something that is incredibly difficult to detect because our employees might know how to get around our security systems. They know how we operate. They know how to fly just under the radar to carry out whatever they're doing. And in the last 2 years, we've heard of the Great Resignation as millions of employees are looking for other employment opportunities, and in many cases, attempting to take sensitive data with them. The rise in remote work and cloud service providers has really just made it harder for our security teams to have oversight into these types of attacks. And of course, ransomware. Ransomware has been the biggest headline over the last few years. In fact, my 86-year-old grandmother even texted me after Colonial Pipeline and asked what we were doing to help with that. So if my grandma knows about ransomware, I think it's safe to say everyone here is pretty well aware of the impact of it. But we are seeing it continue to evolve. Actors are targeting our backup infrastructure, our cloud service providers, the things that we rely on to try and get back after an attack. And it's always worth noting that ransomware is more than the cost of the ransom. There's the disruption, there's the downtime, there's that cost of recovery, there's the loss in trust in your business. The cost of ransomware is much more widespread. Now, we can predict that we'll continue to see these trends throughout the rest of this year and moving into next year. But while we can predict the trends maybe, we can't predict what they will look like. And that gets to those unknown unknowns. How do you predict what is coming next? Especially if we keep in mind that attackers will start to use AI to be more stealthy, to try and fly under the radar of our existing technologies. Looking at how we've always approached cybersecurity, we like to refer to this as the rearview mirror approach. Looking at the attacks of yesterday to try and predict what's going to come tomorrow. And this is flawed in a few ways. Firstly, it's overly reliant on known indicators of compromise, known bad that is often trivial for attackers to change. On the other hand, we may have playbooks, but again, this is still dependent on what we've seen in those previous attacks. And we're seeing attackers change their techniques, use living off the land so they can blend into our existing admin activity. These legacy tools are retrospective, and they often lack full visibility and context. They're siloed. You have a tool for email, a tool for your network, a tool for your SaaS providers. But that's just more tools for the security team to learn and to try and piece together all of the context in order to successfully investigate a threat. And when it comes to any sort of automated response from these tools, we typically see one of two things. The response is either too timid, it doesn't do enough to actually prevent a threat from spreading through the network, or it's too aggressive. It shuts down entire systems and in some cases could cause more disruption than the original attack itself. So looking at these flaws in our legacy approaches and comparing that to the current threat landscape, we know that we need a new approach in how we look at cybersecurity. And at Darktrace, our solution to that is powered by self-learning AI. Learning what is unique for every business and using that to detect unusual activity, to detect the presence of a threat. Not only just detect that, but respond to it in a proportionate manner and investigate that threat, all powered by this concept of self-learning AI. Now, to dive a little bit deeper into that self-learning concept, it really is about learning a unique business from the inside out, from the ground up. It's not making any prior assumptions saying, these are the threats that financial institutions often face, or based on your region, these are the nation states that you should be concerned about. No, it learns every unique business, and not only that, but it adapts. As the business grows, as the environment changes, as you move to cloud infrastructure away from on-premises, or you adopt new tools, the AI will also adapt and learn that new sense of normal. Importantly here, this is data agnostic. It can work in any area of the digital environment and add context across those areas. Learning what is normal for your email environment. Where do you communicate? What link domains do we normally see? And applying that to the network as well and to the software as a service providers. In this, it can identify subtle signs of never before seen attacks. It's not looking over your shoulder, but looking at what your business is and looking at any sense of not normal, any deviation from that established self that the AI has learned. Now this part is really just speaking about the detection. As we talked about earlier, it's great if you can detect threats, but you really need a response. Humans cannot respond fast enough to the attacks that we are seeing today. And from here, we introduce the concept of autonomous response, which is powered by that self-learning, powered by that understanding of what is normal for the business. And in that, it can take proportionate response to enforce that normal. I'll walk through some examples shortly where we can see exactly what this looks like in action. But it really is an intelligent response. Based on the type of threat we're seeing, what is the most surgical action that we can take to disrupt that threat, but not interrupt the business? That's the whole concept behind this, not interrupting the business, allowing things to continue by just neutralizing the anomalous, unusual activity. Again, this can act across the entire digital estate and protect all of the areas of your business. For Darktrace, we present this through Darktrace Respond or Antigena, and like I said, it can act across all areas of the digital environment. Now, when Respond takes that action, it can either do so by taking self-directed steps to neutralize the threat as it's determined, or it can hand off its decisions to other software solutions through integrations with a number of different providers, some of which are seen here. The important thing is that intelligent decision-making, taking those proportionate actions and taking them at machine speed. Now, let's take a look at a couple of examples. First, I'd like to start with a kind of hypothetical attack of what this might look like. So, say an employee receives an email from a supplier that they normally work with, but that supplier's account has been compromised, and the email contains a phishing link. Well, with some of these, supply chain attacks seen via email, even ones that I've seen, it's pretty difficult to spot, especially if you have that inherent trust of the person you're working with. And so an employee might click on that, they might download some malware onto their device. But with this autonomous response, with that self-learning, it can identify the subtle deviations that the person emailing is speaking in a slightly different manner than they normally do. And the fact that the link they sent, they've never sent a link to that service before, and in fact, no one in the environment had ever received a link with that domain. That autonomous response can block just that suspicious link, can prevent the user from accessing that, and prevent them from downloading additional malware. And honestly, this could likely be done without the user even realizing that anything has happened. But say the attack continues. Say the user was able to download malware onto their device, or maybe they brought in a personal device that was already compromised. What happens then? Well, in those cases, we would typically see command and control activity starting. The attacker would attempt to reach out to their infrastructure. Now, with the legacy approach, these tools might block it if these are known bad domains that have been seen before, if we know that this is associated with a specific attack. But like I said earlier, it's trivial for attackers to change their infrastructure, especially leveraging all of the cloud service and other free providers out there. So with those legacy tools, this command and control may have continued. But with that self-learning AI, it can pick up again on the fact that the device doesn't normally communicate in this pattern to external websites. And again, the fact that that domain is highly rare for the environment. There, it can stop. It can prevent just those unusual connections, taking proportionate action to block that specific activity, while allowing the rest of that user's normal web browsing and work behavior to continue. Even if the attacker switches their infrastructure mid-attack, that autonomous response can immediately adapt and block that activity again, preventing additional malware downloads and preventing this attack from spreading through the network. But again, if the attack were to continue, we might see the attacker try to exfiltrate some data. They might leverage a service that is commonly used in that organization, for example, OneDrive. It's likely not blocked. The user is likely, or the attacker, is likely able to use that user's account to successfully exfiltrate data. Again, self-learning AI picks up on what is different about that, and it can stop just that unusual upload, while still allowing legitimate OneDrive activity to continue. I think you get the point that it'll take proportionate action at every stage. But let's take a look at some real-life case studies that our analysts have seen in the wild. One of these has autonomous response, and the other one did not. And I think you can guess that this was the attack that did not have any sort of autonomous response in place. Now, this was a Sodinokibi ransomware attack. Sodinokibi is associated with the Art Evil gang. And they're pretty notorious for their use of double extortion tactics. They not only encrypt data locally on the network, but they will exfiltrate as much data as they can and hold that for ransom, threatening to leak it on the dark web or sell it for auction if the ransom is not paid. In this case, we saw the attack play out along the full life cycle, starting with a compromised IT credential. Now, given the fact that they were able to successfully compromise this IT credential, they were very easily able to blend in to existing administrative activity, something that would have been really difficult for a human to spot on its own. You know, is this actually my IT admin, or is this, an attacker who has this credential compromised? Here we saw that credential being used to access sensitive servers, and those servers immediately started engaging in other unusual activity, connecting out to rare websites and exfiltrating data. Now, this was detected as unusual behavior for these servers, for that credential to access them in this way. However, there was no autonomous response in place, and the organization was unable to act quickly enough and actually action these alerts in an appropriate manner. So what happened is the attack was able to continue. It spread to more devices in the network, as we saw reconnaissance, we saw lateral movement, and then further suspicious activity from all of those devices. Ultimately, about 3 weeks after the initial credential compromise, the ransomware was deployed. It used a common administration tool, psexec, again, an attempt to blend in as normal until the attacker was ready to cause the most damage by encrypting mass amounts of files on the environment. Again, here you can see that entire life cycle play out. But with autonomous response, it would have stopped this activity at the earliest stage, before the attacker had been able to compromise sensitive servers, before any data was exfiltrated from the environment. So let's take a look with that response. Now, this was a Log4j attack. At Darktrace, we started to see these attacks against internet-facing devices come almost immediately after the vulnerability was publicly released. And in this case, an exposed internet server was successfully exploited via Log4j. And immediately after we saw that, it started initiating unusual connections. The server started connecting outbound via HTTP to rare external endpoints, attempting that command and control and likely setting up for further malware downloads. However, with that autonomous response in place, it immediately kicked in to block connections to that malicious IP address for 2 hours. It did this to prevent it from further spreading, to prevent further malware from being downloaded. And the system also alerted the security team, letting them know that something had happened on one of their externally facing servers and that they needed to investigate further. Here, the attack was brought to an end, and importantly, the server was still able to act in its normal function while this was happening. While the malicious activity was stopped, the server's normal behavior was not. I've talked a lot about the self-learning AI for detect and respond. Here, we can actually see how this investigated the attack, how it investigated those unusual command and control connections and attempted file downloads, and how it provided a full write-up to the security team, giving them key pieces of information such as the time, the IP addresses, the amount of data transferred, the amount of connections. And at the bottom here, you can actually see this activity as the compromised server started to connect outbound to that malicious IP address. At the very bottom, you can see that this was rare for the server based on its established pattern of life, and that this was new behavior. And 2 seconds later, you see that response kick in, blocking connections to a specific IP on a specific port, not fully taking down the server, but just taking that proportionate response to contain the attack. Now, I wanted to close with talking about trust in the AI, because we don't expect our security teams to just fully hand over control to AI and say, do what you want, stop all of the activity that you think is bad, and we'll go from there. With our customers with Darktrace Respond, we walk them through a maturity model and specific configurations based on their risk profile. We start in fully passive mode, building trust, seeing what the response would be to potential threats in their environment, so that customers can understand what action would it take and how would this actually look in practice. We move from that passive mode to human confirmation, still very much keeping the human in the loop, where the response will be sent as an alert to the customer, and they can confirm, do I want it to take this action, or is this something I recognize? Go ahead and clear that out. The last step is fully autonomous mode, allowing the AI to take that response on its own. But even this is not all or nothing. There are a number of different configurations that can be made based on what devices, users, areas of the environment the customer wants protected the most, or what behaviors they would want that autonomous response to take immediate action. For example, taking action for high-fidelity threats like ransomware, but still allowing the human some control over other responses. This can even be done on a schedule. There's really a number of configurations that can be taken so that customers are comfortable with this response, but so they are also fully protected. I don't mean to say that this takes a lot of configuration or that this is something that needs a lot of upkeep. Once it is set up, it is lightweight to run, and all of the responses and alerts can be consumed through the Darktrace mobile app. So you're able to view any active actions or confirm any responses on the go. Scalable and configurable based on a specific business's needs and risks. Similar to how that self-learning AI is learning that business, autonomous response can be configured specifically for your needs. Now, I'd just like to close with a couple of testimonies here. Autonomous response is something that many of our customers have been using successfully for years. We have seen this in practice. And the response from our customers is that it allows them to sleep easier at night, knowing that they are protected even when their security team is not physically watching their environment. They appreciate that it can take a broad range of proportionate actions, again, containing threats at the earliest stage without bringing in additional business disruption. And I think, especially as a way to close out and based on our previous presentation in here, it's really not a matter of if you will use AI in this manner, it is a matter of when. So thank you all for your time, and I think we do have a couple minutes for questions if anyone has anything. Thank you. Yep.
So what if I want to do something I've never done before, nobody in my organization has done before, so AI will just prevent me from innovating?
Yeah, that is a great question. So if you didn't hear, what if you're doing something you've never done before, you're innovating, is the AI just going to block that activity? Well, I think that is a great question, and it is a legitimate concern. I think what we would often see in that case is, again, it's that configuration. The autonomous response doesn't need to be applied in a blanket fashion across the entire environment. In fact, we often work with our customers to identify developers, identify people that are going to be doing some new things, because that is the purpose of their role. And we could even say, protect these users, allow them to engage in innovation, but if you do see something truly concerning, only then take the response. Yeah, thank you for that. All right. Oh, go ahead.
Where does Darktrace kind of sit in terms of how it interacts with taking defense and performing like at the moment type of responses? Like, is it always connected to cloud, or is there a way to also have it kind of run isolated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, how does Darktrace sit? Is it, based on cloud? Is it isolated? And I think the answer is it depends. It depends on the type of environment we're protecting. With email, we can integrate directly with email providers. We can integrate with cloud providers, with firewalls on the network. We can also have, Darktrace respond, take action on its own. So it really is based on the type of environment. We may have those self-directed actions, or take those actions through integrations with other solutions. And happy to talk to you more after about specific use cases. Great.
Well, first question. So as you've innovated and you begin to then deploy, are your configurations granular enough that, say, I deployed to a web farm, I have new expected traffic. The web farm's already learned certain behavior. Is it now going to see this new traffic, this new product we put out there as a threat? Or is it still based off of a set of core rules that says, like, these are not bad actors, and now you're innovating, you're working with a new company, and that's maybe something you haven't seen before, but it's okay. You don't want to stop, once you're ready to go to production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is something that we've certainly considered, because businesses don't remain static. And that's where the AI is not a singular baseline. It's not, okay, Darktrace was installed in November of 2018, and this is what we always think is normal. It will adapt to new providers. And there may be times where you adapt that response as you're introducing something new in, and just allowing the system more time to learn. But it is fully adaptive, and we saw that firsthand with the move to remote work, where all of a sudden the way that we were operating was entirely different than ever before, but the AI was able to pick up on those new tools and new patterns of normal. Yeah?
We talked about the ransomware.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a case study where Darktrace prevented the ransomware? If not, where do you see the maturity level to prevent it?
Yeah, So do we have case studies where Darktrace prevented ransomware? Absolutely. Darktrace's blog on our website, we've got a number of really in-depth case studies, and it walks through exactly what that looked like from detect and respond. I think one thing that's interesting, though, is if we've really successfully prevented a ransomware attack, there isn't much that's interesting to report on. Because if we successfully lock down that attack at the initial stage, at that first compromised user or device, then it doesn't seem like anything that is super interesting. But we do have a number of examples that kind of run the spectrum on our website. I'd encourage you to check it out. Yes?
How do you measure the success of the product?
Great question. How do you measure the success of the product? Well, we have a number of different reporting where we can see, how much is the AI actually saving your team time? What types of threats are we seeing, and where do those fall on the attack lifecycle? Ideally, we're not seeing the end stages of attacks, but we are detecting and preventing them at that initial infection stage. So there's a number of different ways to look at it, also through measurement against things like the MITRE framework as well as something that is built into Darktrace. So you can see where those detections and responses lie. Great. Well, I think that was pretty much all the time. Again, really appreciate the questions and attention. And if you have any further questions, feel free to find me out on the floor later on.